Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. President Zelenskyy says he hopes they can finish the war this year as world leaders gather in Kyiv to mark the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron heads to Washington to meet President Trump, with Ukraine peace talks expected to be top of the agenda. And Friedrich Merz's Conservatives have won Germany's election as the far-right AfD sees a historic surge in support. Our top story today, world leaders have gathered in Kyiv to mark the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as President Zelenskyy says he hopes we can finish the war this year, warning countries with significant Russian-speaking populations they could be next in Moscow's sights. For more on this, we can now speak to our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshova, who joins me from Moscow. Dasha, thank you for joining me. There's been a huge sign of unity in Ukraine today and new sanctions from the UK. Meanwhile, Russia's foreign minister has been in Ankara meeting Turkey's president. Turkey said it will host possible talks between Russia and Ukraine. How else has Russia marked the anniversary 3 years on?
Well, this date is not marked in Russia. We have heard from several Russian officials, however, very different comments, different from the previous two anniversaries. And they are different in a sense that now we have more conversations about the possibility of negotiated settlement to this conflict in Ukraine. So in Russia, the very strong sense is that it is time now that the negotiations should be started. But having said that, we also understand that Russia is not dropping the military option and preparing its military, and says that the boosting of the Russian armed forces is the key strategic priority of Russia at this stage. That's according to President Vladimir Putin, who was speaking earlier on the day of the Defender of Fatherland. So we have heard the Russian officials all say that there is a very strong possibility of a negotiated solution at this stage, as Russia and the United States have started talking to one another, with Vasily Nebenzia, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, most recently saying that the American authorities are now seeing the real face of the authorities in Ukraine, also saying that capitulation of Kyiv is the matter of time, not the possibility. So this says the sentiment in Russia is that time has come for a negotiated solution, but at the same time Moscow wants to make sure that its concerns are alleviated and its demands in those negotiations are met.
Yes, indeed. Time for negotiations. The UK Prime Minister also said today that Donald Trump, Dasha, has really changed the global conversation over the last few weeks, and it has created an opportunity, but insisted now we must get the fundamentals right. What terms is Putin looking for in these peace talks?
Well, according to the statements from the Russian officials, the underlining idea in Russia is that the root causes, as Russia describes them, of the conflict should be addressed. And those include the potential membership of Ukraine in NATO. Moscow wants any deal on Ukraine to make sure that it is not happening. Also, Russia has said that there will be no territorial concessions to the Ukrainian side, and noted that any cessation of hostilities, cessation of fighting on the Russian side will only take place when there is the agreement, then there is a deal negotiated, and that deal will be suiting the Russian side, because Moscow insists that it has already seen how things were promised and never fulfilled, and Moscow is not falling into the same trap again. And the understanding in Moscow is that there has to be the lasting solution. No quick fixes, no cessation of hostilities or freezing of the conflict along the existing conflict lines will be acceptable for Russia. Russia does not want this conflict to erupt Again, in a matter of years, Russia wants the lasting peace for this conflict, and therefore Moscow once again reiterates its demands that have been outlined before. Having said that, they also insist that the arrangements negotiated in Istanbul in 2022 could serve as the basis for this negotiated settlement.
Meanwhile, Putin has actually spoken to China's Xi Jinping on the phone about these US-Russia talks. Can you explain the significance of this conversation to us, Dasha?
Well, what the Russian president wanted to do, according to the Kremlin, is to inform the Chinese side about the negotiations that Moscow held with Washington, and it is part of the strategic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing. So in this conversation, the sides have exchanged opinions on how those talks have proceeded and how those talks could actually proceed even further. Actually, the Chinese representative most recently said that the window of opportunity for solving this conflict through the negotiated means is now open. So certainly the clear picture is that Moscow wants to make sure that China understands what Russia is talking about to the United States at this stage, but also in this conversation they have been talking the bilateral relations as well as the reciprocal visits of the two presidents to each other's countries. An important conversation given the very fact that Russia and the United States will continue their bilateral negotiations that are intertwined with another track of talks on Ukraine.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. Staying with the Middle East, and the White House says it supports Israel's decision to delay the release of Palestinian prisoners. 600 were due to be freed as part of the ceasefire agreement, but Tel Aviv has gone back on its promise, citing the so-called barbaric treatment of Israeli hostages returned by Hamas. France is preparing for its biggest ever child sex abuse trial. 74-year-old surgeon Joël Lescouranek is accused of allegedly raping or sexually abusing 299 patients. The charges are over 3 decades, with most of his victims' children under his care. Lescouranek does not deny the allegations, but claims he does not remember everything. A suspended British Member of Parliament has been jailed for 10 weeks after punching a man. Former Labour MP Mike Amesbury hit the 45-year-old man in October last year and pleaded guilty to the assault in January. The attack knocked the victim to the ground. Amesbury continued to hit him until members of the public did intervene. And Pope Francis continues to rest under medical care and remains under a critical condition. The pontiff was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital on February the 14th. The latest statement issued by the Vatican described the Pope as alert and also well-orientated. President Trump has named right-wing commentator Dan Bongino as Deputy Director of the FBI. Bongino will serve under recently confirmed FBI Director Kash Patel. The 50-year-old has worked for the New York Police Department and the Secret Service and has been a part of the protection detail for Presidents George W. Bush and also Barack Obama. Over $600,000 in donations has been raised for Luigi Mangioni's legal defense. The 26-year-old is charged with the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in Manhattan in December. The donation page says funds will be sent to Mangioni's attorney. Should he refuse the money, it will be donated to legal funds for other U.S. political prisoners and defendants facing politicized charges. India and the UK are expected to restart trade talks. Negotiations were abruptly halted as both nations held general elections. The British Business and Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds is now in New Delhi today, where he will meet his Indian counterpart, Piyush Goyal. And finally, Conclave has claimed the top prize at the Screen Actors Guild Awards. Other winners included Demi Moore and Timothy Chalamet. The ceremony is the last major awards event ahead of the Oscars, which is happening next weekend. To Germany where Friedrich Merz's Christian Democratic Union and the Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, have won the country's elections. Speaking earlier today, Merz, who's likely to become Germany's next chancellor, said he would work on forming a government as soon as possible. Here's what he told the crowds.
But now, we're going to talk to each other, and the main thing is to create a government in Germany that is capable of acting as quickly as possible with a good parliamentary majority. Because, dear friends, the world out there is not waiting for us, and it is not waiting for lengthy coalition talks and negotiations. We must now quickly regain our ability to act so that we can do the right thing at home, so that we can be present in Europe again, so that the world realizes that Germany is being governed reliably again.
The CDU-CSU were the favourites throughout and took the largest share of the vote at 28.6%. The far-right AfD made big gains too, taking a record 20.8% chunk of the electorate. It's the best result in a federal election since it was formed back in 2013. We can now go live to Berlin to speak to our correspondent there, Trent Murray. Trent, good evening to you. Not a massive surprise result, actually. The CDU were favourites to win. How has the news gone down in Berlin? And when could we see Friedrich Merz announced as the Chancellor?
Yeah, that's right, Leigh Ann. The pollsters seemingly in this election were bang on the money with their prediction that the CDU would not only win the election but also garner around 30% of the vote. Friedrich Merz last night very quick out of the gates to claim victory, saying he had a mandate now to try and form a government, but he still doesn't have a majority in its outright. And that is not uncommon here. That's a bit of a quirk of the German system, that not just one party will form a majority on its own. Coalition talks, always necessary. And we understand he is now locked in those negotiations with the Social Democrats from the centre-left. It might seem unusual for a Conservative and a centre-left party to partner together on a grand coalition, but it is not uncommon here. It's certainly how former Chancellor Angela Merkel governed throughout much of her 16 years in office. The next steps really are for the two parties to go through their respective policies and manifestos they took to the election. Compromises will have to be made, certain agendas will have to be dropped, and then of course you have the question of which politicians will become ministers and take over certain ministries. All of that happening right now. Friedrich Merz will lead those negotiations. In terms of the timing, it could take days, it could take weeks, but what he is saying is that the world cannot wait for Germany. Given some of the uncertainty right now with Ukraine and Russia and the Trump administration, it's critical that the German government gets its act together and puts a new chancellor into office as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, Trent. And as we did mention, they didn't win, but historic gains for the AfD. The European markets have already reacted to the results we saw in Germany. Was the economy a really big factor for voters when they came to make their decision?
Look, all of the polling suggests it was, and it's probably no surprise. Germany right now is on the verge of having its third year of contraction. It would be the longest period of contraction since the end of World War II. It's also having major issues with unemployment, with inflation. Much of that has been driven by the war in Ukraine because Previous to that conflict, Germany got most of its energy from Russia through gas supplies. That was all cut off in the wake of that war, meaning they've had to sort of scramble to find alternative energy sources. But it's really caused economic problems, particularly in big industry like the automakers. And I think in many ways voters punished Olaf Scholz for that, the current Chancellor, given some of those economic problems. The AfD, though, also did try to make headwind on that issue alongside a number of other issues, including immigration, law and order, and they now will become the official opposition in Germany. Their leader, Alice Weidel, will become the opposition leader. They feel emboldened, they feel energised, they feel that they are going to hold this new government to account and try and play the long game ahead of the next election in 2029, where they're already saying that they believe that next time around they will be able to place number one.
Trent, you mentioned him there, but embarrassing for the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who has taken this full responsibility for the party's failure here. What kind of coalition could we see between the SPD and the CDU and also the CSU? We know, as you did say, this is one of the sort of niches about German elections and German governments, is the coalitions.
Yeah, look, it was not a good night for Olaf Scholz, and I think him and his party were bracing for that based on what the polls were telling us. I mean, he led the centre-left Social Democrats to their worst election result in post-war Germany. And I think in many ways, from a personal legacy perspective, he will be disappointed. He was only in office for one term following Angela Merkel's years in office. She was here for 16 years. So seemingly for Olaf Scholz, I guess there will be a period of reflection to try and work out what went wrong. But again, it's one of the quirks of the system that despite the fact that they didn't perform very well, they are now the favourites to enter coalition. In fact, of the past 27 years, the Social Democrat Party here has been in government for 23 of them in some form of coalition, either as the major party or the minor coalition partner. So right now we understand those negotiations are happening. The only reason that Friedrich Merz is having those discussions, though, with the Social Democrats is because he has refused to work with the AfD. Even though they came second, even though they've got a much larger vote share, he believes they're too extremist, too far to the right. He doesn't want to do business with them, which is why he's reaching across the political aisle to his political opponents who are in the centre-left. And despite being a Conservative Chancellor, or he soon will be, he believes they are the best path forward to try and form a government here to lead Germany.
But Trent, you know, the AfD, we are talking there, they got a big majority of the vote count. How are people actually feeling who voted for them by the fact they won't be able to join these coalition talks?
Well, look, I think that's a really good question. And I think moving forward, what you will see is the AfD really try and hold the Chancellor's or the new Chancellor's feet to the fire on a lot of this, saying that you went to the electorate promising a conservative agenda and now you've scrapped a lot of it in order to enter government with a centre-left party. And I think that is the real danger for Friedrich Merz going into his term in office, is that he really is going to be outflanked in many ways on the right, I think, by the AfD. I mean, they are already describing themselves as the People's Party of Germany. They feel emboldened. They feel that they've got the wind in their sails. And I think for the broader far-right movement in Europe, they'll be looking at this with some optimism because, of course, what happens in Germany matters to the rest of the European Union. Germany is by far the biggest member. And so some of those other countries with elections coming up, including France and other places, will feel that maybe what happened here overnight is a reflection of a broader conservative far-right wave that could be coming in other parts of the EU.
Absolutely. Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you so much for joining me. Now let's take a look at the top business news. Apple is planning a 250,000 square foot factory in Texas to build AI servers, which will add around 200,000 research and development jobs across the US. The tech giant also said it's planning to spend $500 billion in America over the next 4 years. Many of Apple's products that are assembled in China could face 10% tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump earlier this month. Europe's second largest car maker, Stellantis, is facing a dilemma as its chairman, John Elkann, searches for a new CEO. The company operates 14 brands, more than its major rivals, and deciding which automaker has a viable future is a significant priority for the incoming chief executive. The former CEO, Carlos Tavares, was forced out in December due to slumping sales and profit margins in the US market. Let's go to sports news now. And Liverpool have taken another step towards the Premier League title with a 2-0 win at Manchester City. That's after Mo Salah scored their first goal and set up the second as they went 11 points clear at the top. On Sunday, Arne Slot's side have 64 points from 27 matches ahead of second place Arsenal, who have a game in hand. Fiorentina striker Moise Kean has been discharged from hospital following tests after he collapsed on the pitch on Sunday. The Italian forward suffered a hand injury during his side's 1-0 defeat at Hellas Verona. Kean played on for 6 minutes after colliding with the knee of defender Pavel Davidovic. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron is in Washington today visiting Donald Trump. He is the first European leader to go to the White House since the start of Trump's second term as president. The two are expected to discuss the war in Ukraine and also tariffs. For more on this, I'm now joined from Paris by French journalist and author of Fixing France, Nabila Ramdani. Nabila, good evening to you. Pleasure to have you on the show. What is Macron's principal objective today, and how is he projecting the meeting to the French people?
Well, Emmanuel Macron arrived at the White House a short while ago, and he held a very brief bilateral meeting with Donald Trump. And they are now due to give a joint press conference, followed by dinner and indeed a meeting with senators. But then Emmanuel Macron will be heading straight back to Paris within a few hours. And this gives the impression of an emergency meeting. And this is exactly the impression that Mr. Macron wants to project. And today is the third anniversary of Russia's ground invasion of Ukraine. And the French are extremely fearful that the Americans are now so supportive of Vladimir Putin's Russia that they will sell Ukraine out and will end the war in Russia's favor.
Nabila, apologies, but the reality is that Macron right now is walking a tightrope, isn't he? He's walking a tightrope, as you mentioned, Ukraine's third anniversary, but he's also got to have constructive meetings with Donald Trump and make sure he keeps the US on side. Do you think he's the man to do this for Europe?
You know, it was only a week ago that Macron held an emergency meeting in Paris for European leaders. And the focus was very much on showing massive support for Ukraine, because there's huge concern in Europe at the wild pronouncements being made by a maverick American administrations. And in past days, Donald Trump has effectively authorized the ethnic cleansing of large parts of Palestine, but also he refused to sign an artificial intelligence statement prepared at a Paris AI summit. And his words about Ukraine have certainly caused a lot of alarm. And that's why Mr. Macron wants clarification from Trump and has even attacked him openly. He said, I'm going to tell him that he can't be weak in the face of Putin when he'll have to face China next. That's not you. It's not your trademark. It's not your interest. It will be a huge strategic mistake. So Macron's words will be very bold indeed. And this has been supported, if you like, by an Elysee Palace a spokesman who this very morning said this. in this particularly serious moment, France, the United States, and European allies must maintain a permanent and trusting dialogue with the security of Ukraine and Europe at stake. And the fact that Macron is the first European leader to go and meet Donald Trump during his second administration says a lot in terms of how he gets on with the man.
Yes, indeed. But it is going to be a tricky situation, no matter even if Macron has strong words, because we've heard from Donald Trump and from his government at the moment. But what kind of relationship does Macron have with Trump? And is it one that's likely to actually be productive? Do you think Macron can change Trump's mind, can sway the Ukraine talks, the negotiations, get Ukraine at the table?
Well, I think beyond the realpolitik, Mr. Macron, as I said, will be the first senior European leader to visit Washington. And Macron appears ready to answer Trump's call to boost defense spending, for example. France spends just over 2% of its gross domestic product on the military. And Macron said last week that Europeans must increase their war effort. Trade is also a key subject to the Macron talks in Washington, and especially efforts to avoid harsh US tariffs. And Macron is also expected to raise opposition to Trump's suggestion that Palestinians be deported from Gaza so that the US can take over the territory in what amounts to the kind of ethnic cleansing favored by the Israeli government. And I would say that Mr. Macron is still relatively young. He's not yet 50. And yet it feels as though he's been spending quality time with Mr. Trump for years. The two of them, the pair, first got to know each other very well during a major Trump visit to Paris back in 2017. And of course, there was a very successful soft power visit by Mr. Trump for the reopening of Notre Dame Cathedral just before Christmas. And this trip comes just after Trump on Friday claimed that Macron has done nothing over the past 3 years to end the war in Ukraine. But as I said, Macron will still seek to persuade Trump that American and indeed European interests are the same, and he will be telling him, if you let Russia take over Ukraine, it will be unstoppable.
Do you think Emmanuel Macron ultimately trusts Trump to honour the agreements on the table?
I think there's certainly an amount of trust between the two men. They have frequently spoken to each other. They are practically just as bold as each other. But as you said earlier, it's not going to be a straightforward deal. And remember, deals are, a favored way of looking at geopolitics for Donald Trump. Everything, as far as he's concerned, is transactional. And Macron is expected to speak to him in these very terms to try to sway Trump. I think Trump's stance on Ukraine will be difficult to sway. He has pretty much an unwavering stance on the Ukraine, but Macron can try and certainly put his case that Europe and indeed America have a lot to gain by collaborating on this very serious matter.
Nabila Ramdani, French journalist and author of Fixing France. I appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Now, more on our top story. World leaders have gathered in Kyiv to mark the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as President Zelenskyy says he hopes we can finish the war this year. I'm now pleased to say I'm joined from Kyiv by Ukrainian President Olena Khomenko, who's a member of the Committee on Security, Defence and Intelligence of the Parliament of Ukraine. Good evening to you, Olena. Leaders from around the world have been gathering in Kyiv today. How crucial is their support to Ukraine right now?
Hello, thank you for having me today. Indeed, many European leaders and our partners and our fellow parliamentarians are gathering here in Kiev today, and me and my colleagues were receiving a delegation from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I'm the member of this assembly. All of them came to Ukraine to demonstrate their unwavering support for the people of Ukraine on the occasion of the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And it is especially critical to feel their support these days while in the UN at the same time, our biggest ally, which is the US, proposes their alternative version of the UN resolution, which would not call the Russian Federation the aggressor state. And this is for the first time since the Russian invasion unfolded. And by the way, we already know that we have 93 United Nations states supporting us. So this is very crucial for Ukraine. And here in Kiev, we also feel very strong political support from so many partners from whom it is evident who is the true aggressor. And of course, these days, their support is indispensable in terms of not only political, but military and financial support. We're deeply grateful to the European Union and the member states also to the United Kingdom and Canada for announcing additional sanctions packages and military packages. So this will definitely help Ukraine to stand strong despite different kinds of pressure the recent days and weeks.
There are reports that the US and Ukraine are close to agreeing a minerals deal. With the economy in Ukraine struggling due to the war, will this actually be a lifeline for the country?
Of course, I think it's a little bit early to talk about what the conditions of the deal would eventually be and whether it will be a lifeline, because what we know that the conditions are being discussed by the parties. And it is important to understand that this deal is not about Ukrainian economy only. Ukraine's main goal is to get the real security guarantees that will ensure that future peace will be stable and long-lasting, and that Russia will not repeat its aggression again and again. So we are waiting for the both sides to finish their work on the deal and agreement, and hope that it will be mutually beneficial and will meet the ultimate goal for our country.
On Sunday, President Zelenskyy also offered to resign if it meant Ukraine could be given NATO membership. What exactly is he trying to achieve here?
The NATO membership is enshrined in the Constitution of Ukraine, and NATO membership is being supported for vast majority of Ukrainians. And the best and the effective and robust security guarantee is NATO membership. And this was reiterated by President Zelenskyy, and also it is supported by our allies. If this is not possible at this stage, then the countries that provided the guarantees to us within security guarantees agreements should provide arms and troops for real security. In other words, we must be able to build our own NATO in Ukraine with 1.5 million army with stronger air defense. And for this, we need, of course, more air defense systems. with the international contingent on the ground. And these actions will help Ukraine to deter Russia and push it back. So security guarantees are essential for Ukraine's survival. So what President Zelenskyy wanted to say, I guess, that NATO membership is very crucial for Ukraine. Unless we don't have NATO membership, we need to have security guarantees from our partners.
But do you actually think that Zelenskyy will resign if this is put on the table?
Well, if there was such a statement, then I trust the words of my president, and I think we should ask this question directly to the president. But he said what he meant.
Trump is pushing both Ukraine and Russia for a swift end to the war. What shall we expect as the next steps for Ukraine?
I would like to stress that Ukrainians want peace than anyone else. And we are ready to engage in the comprehensive dialogue with our partners in order to ensure that Ukraine is strong enough and the war will never be repeated for Ukraine and nor for our European allies. So we have Ukrainians wish peace, but this peace should be fair and just.
Olena, I just want to ask you what life has been like for you over the last 3 years in Ukraine.
It's been challenging. We are united around one goal: politicians, the society, and the whole Ukrainian society. So we are doing everything we can. We put all our efforts, our army, our soldiers are fighting for our independence. So it is challenging, but we are holding on.
Ukrainian MP Olena Khomenko, I appreciate you joining me. Thank you. A reminder of our top stories. President Zelenskyy says he hopes they can finish the war this year as world leaders gather in Kyiv to mark the 3rd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron heads to Washington to meet President Trump, with Ukraine peace talks expected to be top of